3 martinis deep. I watched my husband kiss his secretary under the mistletoe at our lavish office party, in my blood-red velvet dress. They saw me as just another festive ornament, pretty but hollow. They had no idea I was not merely the wife, but the architect of this entire empire. The diamond clutch in my hand did not hold lipstick but a digital command that would turn this celebration into a brutal public trial. My name is Alara Vance, and tonight I was dressed to execute a murder, though not the kind that leaves a body. I stood in the center of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, a flute of vintage champagne sweating against my palm. Thorne Logistics had spared no expense for its annual Christmas gala. A 10-piece symphony orchestra played Vivaldi in the corner, struggling to be heard over the cacophony of performative laughter, while a 6-foot tower of crystal glasses filled with bubbles worth more than most people's annual rent shimmered under the chandeliers. The air was thick, suffocatingly so, smelling of expensive perfume, pine needles, and moral decay. At 34 years old, I knew my role in this theater perfectly. I smoothed the fabric of my blood-red velvet gown, a garment chosen specifically because it resembled an open wound, or perhaps the color of retribution. I smiled at the board members, nodded at their wives, and played the part of the supportive, oblivious spouse, even as my mind ran calculations colder than the blizzard raging outside on Fifth Avenue. Then there was Julian, my husband, the CEO. He moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a man who believed his own press releases. He looked dashing in his bespoke tuxedo, soaking up the adoration that I had carefully engineered for him over the last 10 years. He was the face of the company, the charismatic leader, but we both knew who built the engine underneath the hood. He was shining tonight, fueled by the arrogance of a man who thinks he has gotten away with everything. He was not alone. Sienna was right there, hovering at his elbow like a shiny, cheap bauble. She was the new secretary, 24 years old and hungry in a way that made her dangerous. She wore a silver dress with a slit that went up to her hip, bold and entirely inappropriate for a corporate function, but effective. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, her hand brushing his arm with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. She looked at him not as a boss, but as a prize she had already won. I watched them from behind the rim of my glass. I saw the way his fingers grazed the small of her back when he thought no one was looking. I saw the look they exchanged, heavy with secrets and lust. Then, as the orchestra swelled, they slipped away toward a shadowed alcove near the entrance. Beneath a large decorative archway, they thought they were invisible in the dim light, but I saw it. Under a sprig of mistletoe, Julian leaned down and kissed her. It was not a friendly holiday peck. It was deep, hungry, and brazen. The whispers rippled through the room like a virus. I could hear the hushed tones of the junior executives and their dates as they glanced in my direction. Did you see that poor Alara? She has absolutely no idea. Does she? He is going to leave her. Everyone says he is trading up for a newer model in the new year. They looked at me with pity, seeing a fading queen about to be dethroned, a woman too old and too boring to keep a powerful man. They had no idea I could hear every word. It reminded me of the last 3 months, the coldness that had settled over our penthouse, Julian coming in late, smelling of hotel soap and deception. I have to work late again. Ilara, he had said last week, not even looking me in the eye as he adjusted his cufflinks. End-of-year figures are complicated. I will just stay at the hotel near the office. But it is our anniversary week, I had whispered, feigning a tremor in my voice to see how far he would go. Don't start with that, he had snapped, grabbing his coat. I am doing this for us. You are being irrational. Liar. He was doing it for her. My grip tightened on my clutch. It was a hard, rectangular box encrusted with diamonds, heavy enough to be a weapon in a physical fight. But the weapon inside was far more dangerous. Nestled against the silk lining was not a lipstick or a compact, but a black USB drive protected by military-grade encryption. It was the key to the festive trap. Suddenly, the music lowered. A spotlight hit the stage. Julian stepped up to the microphone, tapping it to demand attention. The room went silent. He adjusted his tie and flashed that $1,000,000 smile, but his eyes did not find me in the crowd. They darted straight to Sienna, who was standing by the stage stairs, beaming with anticipation. He took a breath, ready to deliver a speech that would shatter my world. Or so he thought. As Julian soaked up the applause, looking like a golden god under the stage lights, my mind traveled back to a place that smelled nothing like imported orchids and vintage champagne. I grew up in the Rust Belt of Ohio, in a town coated in a permanent layer of gray soot where the snow turned black before it even hit the ground. My father worked in a steel mill for 30 years until his back gave out, and my mother scrubbed floors in houses she could never afford to enter through the front door. They taught me that survival was not about luck or charm. It was about grit, calloused hands, and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in your bones. I was never the Cinderella character waiting for a prince to rescue me from the ashes. I was the one who calculated the structural integrity of the castle to see if it was worth buying. I was a mathematical anomaly in a blue-collar world. I taught myself to code on a public library computer that crashed every 40 minutes. I did not rely on a fairy godmother. I relied on pure, unadulterated intellect. I earned a full-ride scholarship to MIT and graduated valedictorian, leaving the Rust Belt behind not with a glass slipper, but with a degree in advanced algorithmic computational theory. That was how I met Julian 10 years ago. He was a business major with a dazzling smile, a closet full of leased suits, and a head full of dreams that he had absolutely no idea how to execute. He was drowning in debt and grand ideas, a salesman with nothing to sell. I remembered the first night we worked together in his cramped, overheated apartment, surrounded by pizza boxes and unpaid electric bills. He had looked at me with desperation in those charm school eyes. I can sell ice to an Eskimo. Ilara, he had told me, pacing the floor with manic energy, his hands shaking slightly. But this system, I don't know how to make it actually deliver the ice. I need you. I took his messy, incoherent scribbles and turned them into gold. It was my fingers that typed the code for the Thorne Logistics Core algorithm. I built the system that solved the efficiency paradox which had baffled industry giants for decades. That algorithm was the beating heart of the company, the unique selling point that turned a struggling startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Julian did not write a single line of it. He barely knew how to open the command terminal. But as the bank accounts grew, so did his ego. The world saw Julian Thorne, the genius innovator, the visionary tech mogul. They saw the magazine covers and the television interviews. They did not see me sitting in the dark office at 3 a.m, fixing the critical bugs that would have crashed the company's stock value to zero. I let him take the credit. I stepped back into the shadows, becoming the unofficial CFO, the silent partner who made sure the numbers balanced while he drank scotch with investors. I told myself it was a necessary sacrifice. "We are a team, babe," he used to say during those early years, kissing my forehead when he needed me to find a loophole in a contract. "You are the brain. I am the face. We are building a dynasty." I believed him. I thought we were building a fortress for our future family, a legacy that belonged to both of us. But once the foundation was solid, he started looking at the architect with disdain. He began to see my practicality not as an asset, but as a stain on his new polished image. To him, I was still just the girl from Ohio who liked cheap beer and honest work, while he was trying to convince the world he was born into New York royalty. I remembered the argument we had just 2 months ago, right before the coldness set in. We were dressing for a charity gala, and I had suggested we skip the after-party to go over the quarterly projections because I had spotted a discrepancy. He had spun around, his face twisted in a sneer I had never seen before. God, Ilara, can you stop being so provincial, he had snapped, looking at me in the mirror with pure contempt. You are so dry. You lack sparkle. You act like you are still counting pennies in that depressing steel town. You don't fit in this world, Ilara. You bore people. He did not realize that the steel town was exactly what made me dangerous. Steel does not break under pressure. It hardens. He thought I was boring because I was quiet. He forgot that the most dangerous part of a storm is the silence before the lightning strikes. And as I watched him beam at Sienna, I knew the storm had finally arrived. It began 90 days ago, not with a scent of strange perfume on his collar, but with a decimal point that was 2 places to the right of where it should have been. I was reviewing the third quarter financial reports late one night while Julian was allegedly at a networking dinner. My eyes caught a series of recurring flagged transactions. They were listed under ambiguous categories like generic consulting fees and client retention expenses. The sums were astronomical. We were bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars into companies I had never heard of, entities with vague names like Apex Global and Zenith Partners. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard. It did not take long to connect the dots. These shell companies all traced back to a single registered agent in Delaware, linked to a man named Marcus, a shady business partner Julian had insisted we bring on board last year. And the contact person for these accounts was none other than Sienna. She had not been hired for her typing speed or her organizational skills. She was the niece of that partner, brought in specifically to be the conduit for this financial hemorrhage. She was not just a mistress, she was a bagman in a silver dress. That night, I decided to breach the very fortress I had built. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses, and accessed Julian's private server. He thought his password, his birthday, followed by the word winner, was clever. He had no idea that I had installed a backdoor in the system architecture 5 years ago for maintenance purposes. I bypassed his firewalls in less than 40 seconds. What I found made my blood run cold. It was not just a few emails. It was a digital archive of betrayal. I found folder after folder of correspondence between Julian and Sienna. The emails were graphic and trite, filled with the kind of teenage lust that makes you roll your eyes. But hidden amongst the filth were attachments that carried the weight of a felony. They were systematically siphoning assets out of Thorn Logistics and moving them to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were gutting the company from the inside out, turning the empire I built into a hollow shell before the fiscal year ended. Then I found the folder titled New Year, New Me. I clicked it open, expecting perhaps a workout plan or a list of resolutions. Instead, I found a legal strategy. It was a draft for a divorce filing, dated for the 2nd of January. But it was not a standard separation. Julian was planning to file for a fault-based divorce. He had manufactured evidence, dozens of fake text messages and doctored photos to accuse me of adultery with a non-existent tennis instructor. Worse, there were fabricated bank transfers planted on my computer, designed to look like I was the one embezzling company funds. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the room deafening. He was not just leaving me, he was framing me. He intended to paint me as the villain, strip me of my shares, destroy my reputation, and send me to prison while he and Sienna sailed off into the sunset with my money. You bastard, I whispered to the empty room, my voice shaking not with sadness, but with a sudden, clarifying rage. The pain that had been throbbing in my chest for months evaporated instantly, replaced by a sensation of absolute zero. I felt like a machine that had finally been switched to combat mode. I looked at his smiling face in the framed photo on my desk and realized the man I loved was dead. In his place sat a parasite that needed to be exterminated. From that moment on, I became a ghost in my own house. I did not confront him. I did not scream. Instead, I initiated a full-scale covert operation. I mirrored his hard drive, downloading every single incriminatory email and bank transfer to my encrypted external drive. I installed a keylogger on his laptop to capture every password he typed. I placed a tracker on his car and synced his GPS history to my phone. I even tapped the landline and set up a remote recording function on his cell phone through the family cloud plan he was too lazy to manage. I watched the screen as a new email popped up from Sienna to Julian. "Do you think she suspects anything? She has been looking at me weirdly," she wrote. Julian's reply came 2 minutes later. "Ilara, please. She is too busy color-coding her spreadsheets to notice real life. Just stick to the plan. 2 more weeks, and we are free." "Free?" I said aloud, testing the word on my tongue. "We will see who is free when the snow melts." I closed the laptop and went to bed, lying next to him as he breathed his heavy, guilty sleep, and for the first time in months, I slept soundly. I had a lot of work to do. The month of December was a masterclass in domestic theater. I played the part of the doting wife so well that I deserved a standing ovation. I ordered a 12-foot Douglas fir for the living room and spent hours hanging vintage glass ornaments, humming holiday tunes while my husband plotted my destruction in the next room. I asked him about his day with wide, trusting eyes, lulling him into a false sense of security. He thought I was stupid. He thought I was safe. Dinners became a torture session of silence broken only by the tapping of his thumbs against his phone screen. He would sit across from me at our mahogany table, fork hovering over his sea bass, smiling down at his lap like a love-struck teenager. "How is the merger going?" "Darling," I asked one evening, pouring him a glass of Pinot Noir. "You seem, distracted." He snapped his head up, the smile vanishing instantly to be replaced by a mask of annoyance. "It is fine. Just complicated logistics. Sienna and I are working around the clock to get the numbers right for the board." "She is very dedicated," I replied, taking a slow sip of wine to hide the smirk threatening to form. "We should get her a nice bonus." "We are," he muttered, returning to his phone. Sienna, for her part, was getting sloppy, or perhaps just cruel. She started leaving breadcrumbs that were more like billboards. I found a smear of bright coral lipstick on his white collar, a shade I never wore. The car reeked of vanilla and cheap musk. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "He hates your cooking." By the way, I did not block the number. I saved it. While they played their high school games, I went to war. I met with David, my oldest friend from MIT, in a dingy diner in Queens where nobody from our social circle would ever be caught dead. David was not a divorce lawyer. He was a shark who specialized in corporate law and white-collar crime. "You were right," David said, sliding a thick file across the greasy table. "He is using your original source code to automate the laundering. But he made a mistake. He did not check the legacy logs," I said, already knowing the answer. David grinned. "Exactly. He is running the illegal transfers through the core algorithm, the one you wrote. That was Julian's fatal error. He forgot that the code was my child, not his. He was using a weapon he did not understand. That night, while he slept, I accessed the mainframe. I did not stop the laundering. That would have alerted him. Instead, I altered 3 lines of code in the command chain. I redirected the digital footprint. Every illicit dollar, every falsified invoice, every shell company transaction was now being tagged with a digital signature that pointed solely, undeniably, to Julian Thorne. I was no longer the CFO. I was the witness. Then came the final test. 3 days before the party. Julian walked into the library carrying a leather folder. He looked nervous, sweating slightly despite the chill in the room. "Ilara, honey," he started, sitting on the edge of the desk. "My lawyer suggested we sign a post-nuptial supplement. It is just standard procedure to protect our personal assets from any liability with the new expansion. It keeps the house safe." He handed me the document. I read it. It was a trap. The legalese was dense, but the intent was clear. It assigned all future company debt to the spouse me while shielding the primary shareholder him. Of course. Julian, I said, my voice trembling just enough to sound submissive. I trust you. If this protects our home, I will sign it. Great. He exhaled, visibly relaxing. I will go get a pen. In the 30 seconds it took him to walk to the other room, I made my move. I had printed a near-identical document earlier that morning on the same paper stock. I slid the original page 4 out of the stack and replaced it with my version. My version looked exactly the same. Same font, same margins. But the clause regarding liability was reversed. It stated that the primary shareholder assumed full personal responsibility for all corporate debts and legal penalties incurred by the company. He came back with a Mont Blanc pen. Here you go. I signed my name with a flourish. There. Are we safe now? We are, he said, kissing my cheek with cold lips. You are a good wife. Ilara. I know, I whispered to his retreating back. I am the best thing that ever happened to you, and you just signed your death warrant. 1 week before the gala, while Julian was busy selecting the hors d'oeuvres, I was busy constructing a digital bomb. I created a presentation file titled Thorn Logistics 2025 Vision. To the naked eye, it was a standard slide deck filled with boring market analysis and growth projections. However, buried deep within the metadata was a command script set to execute the moment the file was opened. I did not leave anything to chance. I took my laptop to a cafe across the street from the Plaza Hotel and hacked into their internal network. It took me 45 minutes to bypass their security protocols. I gained root access to the Grand Ballroom's audio-visual system and rewrote the firmware for the lighting and soundboard. I ensured that once my presentation began, the manual override switches would be disabled. The only way to stop the show would be to cut the main power grid for the entire block. I still needed a man on the inside to ensure the file made it onto the presentation laptop. I cornered Kevin, Julian's nervous IT assistant, in the server room late one Tuesday evening. He jumped when he saw me, nearly dropping his tablet. Mrs. Thorne, I did not know you were here, he stammered, his eyes darting to the door. Relax. Kevin, I said, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I just need you to swap the Keynote file with this updated version. It has some new graphics Julian wanted. He looked at the USB drive in my hand and hesitated. But Mr. Thorne was very specific about the final version. He said no changes after Monday. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I know about the online gambling debt. Kevin, $12,000 is a lot of money for a junior technician. He went pale. Please, don't tell him. Upload the file, Kevin, and ensure the autoplay feature is enabled. Do that, and your debt stays between us. He took the drive with shaking hands. With the technical trap set, I turned to the legal one. I spent the next 2 days compiling 2 thick dossiers. They contained printed copies of the emails, the bank transfer logs, and the metadata from the shell companies. I placed them in sealed envelopes addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the New York field office of the FBI. I arranged for a private courier to deliver them precisely at 9 o'clock on the night of the party. On Thursday, Julian came home with a small velvet box. He handed it to me with a sheepish grin. Inside was a diamond necklace, heavy and ostentatious, the kind of jewelry a man buys when his conscience is eating him alive. For you, babe, he said, kissing my temple. I know I have been distant. This is to say thank you. I let him clasp the cold metal around my neck. It felt heavy, like a shackle. Oh, Julian, it is stunning, I said, looking at him in the mirror with a smile that did not reach my eyes. I will wear it on Saturday. It will match my dress perfectly. The next day, I ran into Sienna in the hallway at the office. She was wearing a new coat that cost more than her annual salary. She stopped me, looking me up and down with a smirk. You look tired. Ilara, she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. Maybe you should take a vacation after the holidays. You know, somewhere quiet. You are getting a little old for the hustle of the city." I adjusted my scarf, looking at her with the calmness of a predator watching a limping gazelle. "Winter in New York is very cold." "Sienna," I replied softly. "Remember to dress warm." She frowned, confused by the non sequitur, but I walked away before she could respond. My final move was financial self-preservation. I spent Friday morning transferring every cent of my personal inheritance and legitimate investment portfolios into irrevocable trusts based in jurisdictions that did not play nicely with U.S. courts. By the time the banks closed, my personal net worth in America was effectively zero. If Julian tried to sue me for damages, he would be suing a ghost. The night before the party, I stood by our bed in the dark, watching Julian sleep. He was sprawled out, snoring softly, completely unaware that his life was about to end. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a profound sense of pity. He was so confident, so arrogant, and so incredibly stupid. "Sleep tight," I whispered into the darkness. "Tomorrow, you wake up in hell." The spotlight cut through the dim ballroom, blindingly white, centering on Julian as he stood alone on the raised platform. The hum of conversation died down, replaced by the attentive silence of 200 wealthy investors and socialites. I stood in the shadows of a marble pillar, watching him perform. Thorn Logistics was built on two things. Julian boomed, his voice echoing with practiced gravitas. Family and loyalty. We looked to the future, not just for profits, but for legacy. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbles tasting bitter against my tongue. The irony was so thick it nearly choked me. He spoke of loyalty while his mistress stood 10 feet away, smoothing her dress, and he spoke of family while plotting to dismantle ours. "And speaking of the future," Julian continued, flashing a smile that was all teeth, "I want to invite someone up here who represents the new energy of this company. Please welcome our new Chief Operating Officer, Sienna Miller." A ripple of shock went through the room. The applause was polite but hesitant. I heard the gasp of the VP of Operations standing near me, a man who had been with the company for 15 years and had just been passed over for a 24-year-old former receptionist. Sienna walked up the stairs, her hips swaying in that silver dress, soaking in the attention like a lizard basking on a rock. Julian put his arm around her waist, pulling her closer than professional etiquette allowed. "Sienna has been instrumental in our recent growth," he said, looking down at her with a gaze that made my skin crawl. "I want to thank her personally for the long nights of hard work she has dedicated to this firm." Sienna giggled, actually giggled, and covered her mouth in mock modesty. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I gripped the stem of my crystal flute so hard I felt the glass groan under the pressure. Long nights indeed. And to celebrate this new era, Julian announced, pivoting back to the crowd, "we are launching the Thorn Hope Foundation, a charity initiative dedicated to global outreach." I almost laughed out loud. The Thorn Hope Foundation. It was the name of the shell entity they were using to funnel the stolen cash to the Caymans. He was announcing his crime as a benevolent act in front of the very people he was stealing from. The audacity was breathtaking. "But I cannot do this alone," Julian said, extending a hand toward the darkness where I stood. "Ilara, darling, come up here. This is our moment." He needed me one last time. He needed the image of the devoted wife to legitimize the promotion of his mistress and the launch of his fake charity. He wanted the perfect tableau: the genius husband, the young protege, and the supportive wife. I handed my glass to a passing waiter. I smoothed the velvet of my red dress. Then I began to walk. The crowd parted for me. My heels struck the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, sharp sound. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a pendulum swinging. It was the sound of a countdown reaching 0. I walked up the stairs, my chin held high, not looking at the audience, but locking eyes with Julian. He smiled, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Perhaps he saw the predator in me for the first time. I stepped onto the stage and stood between him and Sienna. The air smelled of his expensive cologne and her cloying vanilla perfume. "Here she is," Julian said, handing me the microphone, expecting a few gracious words before he ushered me off. I took the mic. I turned to the crowd, my face composing itself into a dazzling, terrifying smile. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice steady and clear, amplifying through the massive speakers. "It is truly a night of revelations. You have given everyone so much tonight. A new COO, a new foundation. It is only fair that I contribute something as well." I turned to look at him, my smile dropping just enough to let the ice show through. "I have a surprise gift for you, darling." "And for everyone here," I raised my hand and snapped my fingers at the control booth. High above, Kevin, the terrified IT assistant, did exactly as he was told. The massive LED screen behind us, which had been displaying the company logo, flickered and went black. Then, it blazed to life with a harsh, white light. The show had begun. The massive screen behind us did not dissolve into a heartwarming montage of company milestones or wedding photos. Instead, it snapped into the stark, high-contrast black and neon blue interface of the Thorn Logistics internal accounting mainframe. The image was crisp, massive, and undeniable. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It sounded like the sudden depressurization of a cabin. On the screen, live data streams were pulsing like arterial blood. They showed massive blocks of capital moving in real time. A transfer of $4,500,000 was currently initiating, moving from the company's operational reserve to an account labeled Apex Global, Cayman Islands. Julian whipped his head around, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure melting under the stage lights. He grabbed his own lapel microphone, his knuckles white. "Cut the feed," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Kevin cut the damn power. Now, but the screen remained bright and steady. The audio system, which I had locked down with a root-level encryption key only minutes ago, refused to obey him. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the projector and Julian's heavy breathing. I raised my microphone to my lips, my voice calm, the eye of the hurricane. "This is not a technical difficulty. Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my tone conversational, as if I were explaining a quarterly projection. "What you are seeing is a live transparency report. Call it a demonstration of the Christmas fund that my husband and Ms. Sienna have been so diligently building." As if on cue, the screen split. The financial data shifted to the left, and on the right, a cascade of emails and chat logs began to scroll. I had selected the most damning ones. They appeared in giant text, legible even from the back of the ballroom. An email from Julian to Sienna, dated 3 weeks ago, popped up. "She suspects nothing. Once the divorce is finalized on January 2nd, the liquidity will be in the offshore accounts. We leave her with the debt in the empty shell." Another chat log followed. "Make sure the fake evidence of her affair is planted on her laptop by Friday. I want her credibility destroyed before she steps into a courtroom." The crowd erupted. The polite murmurs of the elite turned into a roar of shock and scandal. I saw board members pointing at the screen, their mouths agape. Sienna, realizing her life was disintegrating pixel by pixel, snapped. She let out a guttural shriek that had nothing to do with corporate etiquette. "You bitch," she yelled, lunging toward me with her hands clawed into talons. "Stop it. You are ruining everything." She took 3 steps in her towering heels and then disaster struck. Her foot caught in the excessive fabric of her silver dress, the slit twisting around her ankle. She went down hard, face first, onto the polished wood of the stage. The microphone amplified the heavy thud of her body hitting the floor. It was a pathetic, sprawling mess of silver, sequin, and humiliation. She tried to scramble up, but she just looked like a broken disco ball. Julian ignored her. He was staring at the audience, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands raised in a desperate surrender. "This is fake," he bellowed, trying to shout over the rising commotion. It is a deep fake. She is jealous. She is hysterical. None of this is real." I turned to the screen and pointed a manicured finger at the bottom corner, where a string of code was running in a continuous loop. "Look at the timestamp." "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his lies like a scalpel. "That is the server clock. It is synchronized to the nanosecond. This is live data streaming directly from the server room downstairs. You can lie to the board, you can lie to me, but you cannot argue with the math." I looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the press, the rivals. The flashbulbs were starting to pop now, a stroboscopic nightmare capturing Julian's terror and Sienna's defeat. "My name is Alara Vance," I announced, my voice ringing with finality. "I am the architect of the algorithm that built this company. And tonight, I am formally resigning. I am also submitting this live feed as evidence of grand larceny, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the CEO, Julian Thorne." I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a feedback screech that sounded like a judge's gavel. The double doors at the rear of the grand ballroom flew open with a violence that shook the crystal chandeliers. It was not Father Christmas arriving to hand out coal. It was a tactical team of 6 FBI agents wearing navy blue windbreakers, flanked by 2 stern-faced auditors from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I checked my watch. 9:15 exactly. I had calculated the delivery of my evidence dossier to coincide with the peak of the party. The files I sent contained proof of immediate flight risk, detailing the one-way tickets to the Caymans that Julian had purchased for the following morning. That little detail had turned a standard investigation into an emergency extraction. The agents moved with military precision, swarming the stage before the first scream even left the throat of a guest. Julian stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. The arrogance that had defined him 10 minutes ago evaporated the moment a female agent spun him around and slammed his chest against the podium. "Julian Thorne, you are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement," the agent shouted over the din of the crowd. The metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the microphone that was still live on the floor. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Julian struggled, his face turning a mottled purple. "Alara," he screamed, twisting his head to look at me, spit flying from his lips. You treacherous bitch. You set me up, I will kill you. Do you hear me? I will ruin you." He looked ridiculous. His $3,000 tuxedo was bunched up around his shoulders, and his carefully styled hair was falling into his manic eyes. He was no longer the king of Wall Street. He was just a criminal in a nice suit. Next to him, Sienna was scrambling backward on the floor, trying to distance herself from him as if his guilt were contagious. When an agent reached for her arm, she broke down completely. The facade of the cool, ambitious executive crumbled into a mess of smeared mascara and terror. It was him, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. I didn't know anything. He made me do it. I am just a secretary. He told me it was legal. Please, I am 24. I don't want to go to jail." She threw him under the bus faster than I could have ever predicted. I watched Julian's face as he heard her betrayal. The realization hit him harder than the handcuffs. The woman he destroyed his marriage for was selling him out for a plea deal before they even left the building. Below the stage, the press pool I had anonymously tipped off earlier that afternoon went into a frenzy. The room exploded in blinding white light. The camera flashes popped in rapid succession. a strobe light effect that turned the chaotic scene into a series of stop-motion horrors. They captured every angle of Julian's rage and Sienna's cowardice. It was a fireworks display from hell, and I was the pyrotechnician. I stood motionless in the center of the storm. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply watched them drag my husband toward the exit. He kicked and screamed, losing one of his Italian leather loafers in the process. As the agents hauled them out, the board of directors descended on me. These were men who had dismissed me for years, looking past me to shake Julian's hand. Now, they surrounded me like a pack of wolves, realizing their alpha was dead. Ilara. My God, what is happening? The chairman sputtered, his face pale. The stock is going to plummet in the morning. The assets. If the feds seize the accounts, we are bankrupt. The company is finished. I turned to them, smoothing a wrinkle in my red velvet dress. My pulse was steady. "Calm down, gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through their panic. "The company accounts are indeed frozen. The assets are gone. But Thorn Logistics is not dead unless I say it is." What are you talking about?" the chairman asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "You should have read the intellectual property clause in my marriage contract. Specifically Addendum 4, I replied coldly. The core optimization algorithm, the code that actually runs your trucks, routes your ships, and manages your inventory belongs to me, solely to me. Julian just leased it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only they could hear. Without my code, this company is just a collection of empty warehouses and confused drivers. So, I suggest you step back and let me work. I have a mess to clean up. 7 days later, the air in the conference room of my lawyer's office was so sterile it burned my nostrils. It smelled of lemon polish and impending ruin. Julian sat across from me at the long glass table. He had made bail, but the man sitting there was a hollowed-out version of the husband I used to know. His skin was gray, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands, usually so steady when holding a Scotch glass, were trembling against the mahogany surface. His lawyer, a frantic man named Sterling who charged $800 an hour, tried to start the meeting with bluster. "We are prepared to discuss a settlement." "Mrs. Thorne," Sterling said, adjusting his tie. "However, the current accusations are extreme. We believe a reconciliation regarding the company assets is in everyone's best interest to stabilize the stock price." Julian reached across the table, ignoring his counsel. He looked at me with a desperation that was almost pitiable. "Ilara, please, you have to stop this," he rasped, his voice cracking. "The stock is in free fall. They are talking about prison time. You can't let them do this to me. We are family." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The love I once had for him had been cauterized. "Family," I repeated the word, tasting the bitterness of it. "You destroyed this family the moment you touched her. Now, we are just business partners discussing a liquidation." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. I slammed them onto the glass table with a heavy thud that made Julian jump. "This is the divorce decree," I said calmly. "And this is the post-nuptial supplement you signed last month." Julian frowned, confused. The liability waiver that protects us. Read page 4. "Julian," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. He flipped through the pages with shaking fingers. As he read the clause I had swapped, his eyes went wide. He stopped breathing for a moment. This says I assume full personal liability for all corporate debt," he whispered, looking up at me in horror. And that, in the event of default, my equity is transferred to the spouse to satisfy the creditor." "Ilara." "What did you do? I protected my assets." I replied cold as ice. You signed it. It is notarized. You owe the company millions in stolen funds. Julian, since you cannot pay it back, your 51% stake in Thorn Logistics now belongs to me. It is a debt collection. This is fraud, Sterling shouted, standing up. It is a contract. My lawyer, David, interjected smoothly. And it holds up. Your client signed it willingly. Julian slumped back in his chair, defeated. He knew he was beaten. And Sienna, he asked weakly. Is she going to help? I laughed, a sharp, dry sound. Sienna. She gave an exclusive interview to the New York Post this morning. The headline is, "The Predator Boss Made Me Do It." She is painting you as a monster to save her own skin. Her assets are frozen, and she is singing like a canary to the district attorney. Julian put his head in his hands. I have nothing. You have a choice, I said, sliding the divorce papers toward him. Sign these. Uncontested. You walk away from the company, from the house, from everything. You leave New York. If you do that, I will not release the second batch of evidence regarding the Zurich accounts. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. He did not know that I had already mailed the Zurich files to the FBI that morning. They would find them eventually, but right now, the lie was the lever I needed to pry him loose. You swear, he stammered. You won't release them. Sign the papers, Julian, I commanded. End it. He picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently that the tip scratched the paper before he could write. I never thought you would be this cruel, he murmured, a tear leaking out of his eye. I learned from the best. I replied. He signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper sounded like a guillotine dropping. He pushed the papers back to me, looking like a man who had just signed his own death certificate. Get out, I said. He stood up, unsteady on his feet, and walked out of the office building and stepped onto the sidewalk. The winter air hit my face, biting and cold, but for the first time in 10 years, it felt clean. It felt like freedom. New Year's Eve arrived not with a bang, but with a serene, powerful silence inside my penthouse. The apartment, once a stage for Julian's pretenses, now felt vast and undeniably mine. I sat on the velvet sofa, watching the fireworks erupt over the Hudson River. They were beautiful, violent bursts of light that died as quickly as they were born, much like my husband's career. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up to see a notification from the stock exchange. The shares of Thorn Logistics had stabilized. After a week of volatility, the market had corrected itself. The announcement of my appointment as interim CEO had calmed the investors. They realized that while the face of the company was sitting in a holding cell awaiting trial, the brain of the company was sitting in the corner office. I took a sip of sparkling water and thought about the final secret I had kept, even from the FBI. The USB drive I had clutched that night at the party did not just contain evidence. It contained what I called a skeleton key. When Julian and Sienna initiated their panic transfers to the Cayman Islands, they thought they were moving money into a safe harbor. They did not know that my algorithm had tagged every single digital dollar. The moment the FBI froze the accounts, my program executed a clawback protocol. It did not return the stolen funds to the company's general ledger where the board could squander it on bonuses. Instead, it redirected the capital over $15 million into a newly formed, legitimate nonprofit organization. I had named it the Vance Scholarship Fund. Every cent of the money Julian tried to steal would now go toward full-ride scholarships for kids growing up in the Rust Belt of Ohio. It would pay for tuition, books, and housing for the daughters of steelworkers and the sons of cleaners who had the brains but not the bank accounts to attend places like MIT. I was using his greed to wash the company name clean. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring, a 4-carat stone that Julian had bought to mark his territory rather than his love, glinted in the light of the fireworks. It felt heavy. It felt like a shackle I had worn for too long. I slid the ring off my finger. There was a pale band of skin underneath, a scar from a wound that had finally healed. I dropped the ring into my glass of untouched champagne. It hit the bottom with a dull clink. I stood up and walked to the kitchen island. Without a shred of hesitation, I tipped the glass over the stainless steel sink. I watched the expensive vintage champagne swirl down the drain, carrying the diamond ring with it. I listened to the rattle as it vanished into the garbage disposal unit. Goodbye, Julian, I said to the empty room. Enjoy the sewers. I did not feel sad. I felt lighter, as if gravity had released its hold on me. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of my new executive assistant, Sarah, whom I had recruited for her efficiency, not her hemline. She answered on the second ring, despite the holiday. Mrs. Thorne, Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Sarah, I said, my voice crisp and energized. I hope you are resting. We have a board meeting at 8 o'clock sharp on the 2nd of January. I have some ideas for restructuring the Asia-Pacific division. I will have the files ready. Ma'am, she replied instantly. Good. And Sarah, call me Ms. Vance from now on. I hung up and walked back to the window. The city was alive below me, a grid of endless possibilities. For years, I had been told that I needed to marry rich to secure my future. I had been told that a woman's power was derivative of the man she stood beside. I looked at my reflection in the glass, a woman in her prime, a CEO, a genius, and a survivor. I did not need a rich husband. I was the rich one. I was the architect of my own life, and as the clock struck 12, signaling the start of a new year, I knew the real party was just beginning. It was the party of absolute, terrifying freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your city or country. It is amazing to see our community grow across the world. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people who need a little inspiration to fight back.